Oh, okay, hang on a moment. Talk among yourselves, as they say, while I try and get the slideshow started. Great. Okay, so this is me when I had one of those lockdown haircuts, actually, in that good weather. So just get the boring stuff over and done with. I've got a Facebook page called Positive About Neurodiversity, where I post stuff. I'm on Instagram and that kind of thing. I've got a YouTube channel with lots of ideas about managing the challenges, so feel free to have a look at that. It's under my name, Guy Brewer. The Facebook is Positive About Neurodiversity. I think I'm also on Instagram. That's my phone number if you want to ring me or text me. I'm happy to have a chat at any time about these things. And so I think the slide comes back at the end if you want to catch those details, or feel free to take a screenshot or a photo. Or as I say, I can send this out to people after, because I think that'd be useful. Now, my wonderful social media manager, Luke, has created this amazing picture for me, and it's irresistible, isn't it? I've styled myself as a dyslexia avenger because there's a lot of people I meet have a hard time, and so all of us need to go out there and right wrongs and make the world a better place for people with dyslexia and associated conditions. And really, this is the call to action. It's down to us to do that. Because often the people that I meet, they are the ones in the workplace. They've got to spend time learning the technology and finding time for the coaching, thinking about strategies to manage the challenges. So they need help from all of us. We need to understand what dyslexia is and this other stuff, because there's a lot of connection between dyscalculia and dysgraphia and ADHD and dyspraxia and autistic spectrum disorders. So it's down to us. So that's kind of the point behind this. So here is what dyslexia is in its kind of purest form. If you take the word elephant, for example, it is made up of 3 syllables, elephant. So that's fairly straightforward. The tricky bit is that last syllable, fant, because that's made up of 4 sounds. So you have to decide what, for example, with a f, that is going to be made up. What letters you're going to use in that? So, and there's several options. And this is a challenge for the dyslexic brain, because you've got to decide which option you're going to choose. And then you've got to remember the sequence of that. So you pick your PH from those options and you put it in the front of that 3rd syllable. And then you have to remember that the e and the le come in front of it. It's all a lot of activity for the brain to do, and that's why it's a challenge for people with dyslexia to get that right. Also, if you say elephant to someone with dyslexia, then because people with neurodiverse conditions like dyslexia are very visual thinkers in the main, this is what you can be thinking of. I, who am not dyslexic, I'm quite neurotypical, can see the word elephant in my mind. That really helps me to spell it. If you're seeing pictures of elephants and thinking about where they are, it's a distraction, it's no help at all. So that's dyslexia in its purest form, but there's a bit more to it than that in my experience of meeting people. And I use this mind map, which comes from the internet. It's Times Educational Supplement resources, so it's fairly good quality. I don't know whether it's scientific, but I find it really useful when talking to people because often they've never spoken to anybody about their dyslexia. So what people tend to say, they look at it and they see that bit where it says left right confusion at the top, say, oh, left right, I never knew that was a dyslexic thing. And I meet a lot of people who struggle with left and right. And for example, I met someone who was learning to drive. They were a dietitian, worked for the in a hospital, and they finally passed on their 8th attempt, 8th test, as it were. So, but they can, if you said left or right to them, that just confused them. You had to say, and this is what she told her instructors, say your side or my side. And I meet a lot of people who do that thing with your hand where you make an L with your left hand to remind you. And I was talking to a doctor recently who I'm doing some coaching with. He'd had some training on software which had been delivered remotely, and it wasn't very successful because the person who was training him was saying, oh, well, on the left side of your screen, you've got such and such a thing, and then at the top right, there's such and such a thing. And he was just completely lost. And by the time he found what they were talking about, the person had moved on. So it's, and that is, someone who's well qualified and experienced, not stupid. So it can be an issue for some people, not everybody. Similarly, difficulties with telling the time. Some people have a struggle with that, some people don't. And for example, I do on my YouTube channel once a month a podcast, it used to be though, it's a broadcast, I suppose, with someone with dyslexia who is having a good time. I do it with a local online community network group called See No Bounds, Jamie and Charlotte McAnch. And Jamie is dyslexic, and he always says, why can't he tell the time? And the thing is, he can tell the time, but it takes him so long to work out what the time is that by the time he's worked out that it's 5 to 12, it's kind of moved on from that. But we were, just to do a bit of shameless name dropping, we were interviewing Matt Hancock last month, and Jamie said, how do you get on with telling the time since you work under one of Britain's biggest clocks? And Matt Hancock says, I'm fine, no problems at all. So everybody's a bit different. But if it is an issue, it's a pain in the neck. And I know some people are fine with digital clocks, but not with analog clocks. Some people the other way around. And some people are fine with both or with neither. So there's a lot of variety. And the traditional looking, or the traditional viewpoint of dyslexia is the reading, writing things. And my experience is that people generally learn to read and write okay. And I meet a lot of people who've been to university, and often that's where their dyslexia is picked up, and they get first-class degrees, so they can read and they can write. But what the challenge that dyslexia brings is, as characterized here at the top, difficulty getting ideas on paper. So it can be complicated getting your thoughts organized and down in the kind of shape that you want them, that kind of linear progression that neurotypicals like, from A to Z kind of thing. So organizing your thoughts, getting them down, finding the right word can be difficult. And people often say to me that if they can't find the right word, they have to write a whole new paragraph to say what they wanted to say. So that's extra time. Not only that, is that it can be a distraction, and it can send you off in a different line of thought, or you can't remember what you were thinking when you first embarked on that long paragraph. So the issues with writing are not that you can't, but that it just takes so much longer. And that's even without the spelling and grammar and punctuation stuff, because that also can be a bit of a mystery. And what people tell me is that when they write something, they have to check it and recheck it and recheck it. And I met someone for some coaching once, and we were talking to his manager about his experiences in the workplace. And his manager said, well, to be fair, your emails are pretty good, which was fairly kind of damning with fake praise, I think. And he said, yeah, but I've already checked them 4 times at least before I sent them to you. So it just takes up so much time, and it's stressful, because you know how people will be if they are particular about spelling and grammar. And if you've had a bad time at school on that subject, and many people have, it just chips away at your self-esteem. So that's just a writing thing. And that's assuming that you haven't been kind of excessively distracted by noise around you, or you haven't had that challenge of taking notes in the first place. And if I had £1 in my pocket for every person who told me that taking notes, for example, minutes in a meeting, was one of their greatest struggles at work, I'd be a rich person, because that thing where you have to listen to what people say, you have to decide what to write down about what they're saying, you have to think about the spelling, because you know other people are going to be reading it. You have to still listen to what they are talking about so you can get the next point down. That is, for most people with dyslexia, it's too much. And so what people often do is they try and write everything down, so then they can't even contribute to the meeting because they're so focused on the writing. And then they're spending the rest of the week, often in their evenings or their own time, writing up these minutes when it could have been done so much quicker by other people. So, and if you're a student, then that can be an issue at university. Luckily, if you're a student and you have dyslexia, you've got a diagnosis, then you can get disability student allowance. And that there are lots of gadgets, recording devices that are useful for students for taking notes. And one of the advantages of things like this being online is that you can record what's happening and go back to it. The disadvantage of the recording stuff is you've got to listen to a 2-hour lecture for another 2 hours to find the bits that you want. But at least it's not lost forever. So with the reading stuff, that is another massively time-consuming enterprise, people tell me, because what happens is that it's very difficult to soak the information up in one reading. So what people tell me is they have to read something half a dozen times. So, you know, if you in a job where you get 100 emails a day, that's the equivalent of getting 600 emails a day. It just takes so long. And what's difficult is that if you're distracted halfway through reading something lengthy and you lose your place, you've got to go back to the beginning because you can't remember where you were. A lot of people experience visual disturbance when looking at text so that it's uncomfortable to look at. And if it's moving or blurry or any of those kind of visual disturbance things, then it's just so tiring. So the reading takes a long time. It's hard to embed it, especially if it's something that is not very interesting. And I've been doing a fair bit of coaching recently for people, work coaches at the Department of Work and Pensions, and they constantly have updates through email of guidance and information about rules and regulations. And what I hear from them is that that kind of dry, detailed stuff is so hard to embed in their brains because it's just, it's not real. They can't connect it to anything. What works for them is if they've got someone to talk to about it, you can say, oh, what's this about? And this could be about, say, student finance and universal credit or something, then, or suddenly they're beginning to get a sense of what it's about, and that gives it a bit more life, makes it easier to embed. But it's a challenge. It takes a long time. So then we have this other stuff where you can't remember what words look like and difficulty hearing sounds clearly and similar sounds causing confusion. So all these characteristics, what's interesting is that not everybody has them. A lot of people have memory difficulties because that often comes with the territory, but they kind of all exist on a scale of 1 to 10. So of severity. So for some people they're mild, for some people they're quite severe. So that can be challenging, and they have an impact on each other. And there's a lot of inconsistency, I hear. So some people say they get up in the morning and they don't know whether they're going to have a good day with their spelling and punctuation and writing stuff or not. And depending on what you do for a living, that can have a big impact. And I remember the person who told me that, they said, particularly what they do, luckily they have, there's lots of different things that they have to do. So if they know they're not going to have a good writing day, then they can get on with other stuff that they're doing instead. So if you've got that choice, then that's great. But if you haven't, then life can be a massive struggle. And again, someone told me last week, I think it was, that they'd had the previous Friday, they'd had a terrible day, and they work in a fairly supportive place with a really supportive team. They're working from home, and they said none of their strategies were working. They couldn't concentrate, they couldn't spell, they were having difficulty making sense of the stuff they were reading and their responses to that. So, and they were trying all the recommendations that and the stuff they knew that worked, having breaks, kind of changing to something else, and you know, spending a few minutes with the dog, going outside. But for some reason, it wasn't working. And yet the following day, they were fine. So, so it can be like that. And that is confusing for people who don't understand that dyslexia and ADHD and dyspraxia have this, can be like this. So it's puzzling for other people, but massively frustrating for the person themselves, because you know you've got all this stuff to do, you want to get it done, and if you can't concentrate, you can't get it done, it just can cause a lot of stress. So let me just have a swig of water for a moment, give it a chance to breathe. And I've got to say that I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for lots of questions if you have any, or if you want to write them down somewhere and send them or put them in the chat, that's okay too. So this is, as I say, this is quite a useful tool, this mind map, for getting the conversation going. And I know I haven't mentioned much about the motor control and that sort of thing, but it's there are a lot of characteristics. And obviously I'm talking a lot about my experience with adults, but if you think about this stuff and you think about young people in schools, then the challenges are massive, and teachers are not trained to deal with dyslexia particularly, or if they are, it's a kind of short session at some point in their career. So someone I know very well with the recent diagnosis of ADHD told me, and he's a young chap, he told me when he was doing his school exams, it would take him 15 or 20 minutes to get started with the writing because he wouldn't know where to start, difficulty organizing ideas, getting it down on paper. And if your exam is an hour long kind of thing, or an hour and a half, losing 20 minutes at the start is quite a chunk. And that again dents your confidence. And similarly, I've heard people say, I remember a chap said he did okay in his GCSE exams because it was in a big hall with everybody else in the year group, so there's always a bit of kind of rustling and a buzz going on. This was someone with diagnosis of ADHD and dyslexia, so he liked that background noise. And in fact, when we did the coaching, we did it in a busy cafe because he liked to have buzz going on in the background. But when he came to do his A-levels, there were just half a dozen of them in a small room, complete silence. He couldn't think because his brain was paralyzed by the silence. And so that was the end of his exams. Didn't do very well in his A-levels at all, even though he'd been predicted to do well, because the environment was wrong for him. And I heard a funny story the other day from a local boy who told me, and he's a bit of a celebrity in a way locally, he told me that when he was in school, in order to concentrate, he would put in his headphones and listen to heavy metal, and that would help him do his work. So when the teacher had finished talking, so he get on with the work, he put his headphones in, which would cover it up inside his shirt and all this sort of thing. And so no one would see, and that would help him start. But then if the teacher spotted him, then take your headphones out, you can't possibly be concentrating. And that had exactly the opposite effect to what he needed. So it's a complicated business to get it right because everyone's a bit different. And the important thing is to take time to find out what works for people. And I've got some good questions for that coming up. So, but moving on now, here is the thing. Dyslexia rarely travels alone in my experience, certainly with the people that I meet. And it's viewed as kind of under this umbrella of neurodiversity. So what that means is that the people that I talk to may have had a diagnosis of dyslexia, and you would do because there's so much reading and writing in school and so much in university, and we've got some good, simple, straightforward but expensive tests for finding it out. So there's a kind of spotlight on dyslexia. But lots of people have characteristics from ADHD and or dyspraxia or autistic spectrum disorder condition, I suppose, and or some of this other stuff, dyscalculia as well. So, and that's quite interesting. I often meet people with several diagnoses, and I often meet adults who've had a diagnosis of something because their child has. And I met someone who is a lady who's a publisher, which is ironic for someone with dyslexia. And she grew up, her mother was a head teacher. So she gave her mother gave her lots of help when she was a child to get through school. When she had a child of her own who went to school, that child struggled and came home one day and said to her mother, the publisher, oh, I'm having a test for dyslexia tomorrow. And the mother said, why? You're not dyslexic. And said, well, because I had struggled with copying accurately from the board and getting my spelling right and remember things in sequences. And the mother said, that is completely normal. I'm just exactly the same. So the daughter, being a wise person, said, well, you obviously may have dyslexia too, as in fact turned out to be the case. So sometimes when you're in it, you don't see the challenges from the outside. And everybody that I meet with dyslexia and these other conditions is incredibly hardworking. They're creative, they're great problem solvers. Whether that comes with a condition or whether it's because they have to be, I don't know. And they're imaginative and absolutely determined to do a good job and to get the job done. And those, in my opinion, are the kind of top qualities that any employer would want in anybody. Never mind GCSE English and maths. I mean, that can be done, can't it, these days by computers. But those human characteristics are really important, and I meet them all the time. So, but as I say, I meet people with a kind of collection of diagnoses. I met someone who, and I don't know whether this is a typical story, but I can imagine it's not too unusual. As a child, he was diagnosed with dyspraxia when he was very young. And so that is often associated with fine coordination. So you would pick that up, difficulty writing. And sometimes children with dyspraxia are later to speak than their peers without dyspraxia. And sometimes for adults, that manifests itself as a difficulty getting words out and finding the right word and being able to say it, which, as you can imagine, is massively frustrating. So this chap was diagnosed with dyspraxia as a young child. Then, as he was a bit older, dyslexia was diagnosed. Then as a teenager, his doctor diagnosed him with depression, and he wasn't sure whether that was right or not. But then as a young adult, when he was a student, he had a diagnosis of autism. And now, as I suppose he's about 30, early 30s, he's being investigated for ADHD. So to me, what that tells us is that our kind of categorization or our identification isn't brilliant. And I guess that's because it's complicated as much as anything. But here's the thing. What my experience of talking to all these people is that everybody has, to a greater or lesser extent, difficulties with this stuff in the middle: organization, memory, concentration, time, direction, perception, sequencing. And a lot of people have had their self-confidence dented because you're expected, certainly in school, aren't you, to be good at memorizing stuff, to be able to concentrate when requested. You know, you have to listen to the teacher, and then all of a sudden you've got to focus and do some writing. If you can't control that concentration, then you're deemed to be lazy, stupid, or just crazy, I suppose. And which is just completely the opposite to what people are. So, so I find this a useful mind map when talking to people as well. And again, it's whether it's scientific or not, I don't know, but it certainly chimes with people's experience. And so it's useful when talking to people about what's going on to have this kind of thing around, because it helps people to make sense and to separate the characteristics and the challenges and their experiences from their sense of self-worth and self-esteem. So because, you know, there are challenges out there, it's not your fault. The point is, how can we find ways to make life better? So what's behind it? It's to do with executive function, which is what goes on in the brain. It's stuff to do with working memory, flexible thinking, self-control. Again, I don't go into this in great detail because I'm not a scientist, but the point is dyslexia and these other conditions are a disability, and it has a significant and lifelong effect on people. So, and this is why, because brains are wired differently. So executive function skills are responsible for these things here: paying attention, organizing and planning, getting stuff started, keeping focused and completing it, and seeing things from a different angle, regulating emotions and self-regulation. So self-regulation is to do with time management as well, and things like, you know, eating and going to the toilet. And I remember doing some coaching with a chap who with ADHD, and I was seeing him at I think like 3:30 in the afternoon, and where we met up, which was at his house because it was around the corner from where he worked and it was quiet there. And so I met him there, and every time we met, he'd say, "Oh, I've got to go to the toilet because I haven't been since leaving the house this morning. I've been so busy," and he hadn't had his dinner and he hadn't had a cup of tea. And, you know, these things happen. So whether that's to do with that interoceptive sense, I don't know, but I come across it a fair bit. So think about young people in schools. You know, if you have difficulty, if your executive function skills are compromised, let us say, then you're going to have difficulty paying attention. So there's trouble in the classroom then, isn't it? There's going to be, if you have difficulty organizing, planning and prioritizing, difficulty getting on with your work and getting started. You know, it's you can transpose these into the school setting or the home setting or the work setting and see where problems will arise. And if you don't understand that, you know, the brain is responsible for this stuff, then it's easy to think that people are just being lazy or daydreaming and not interested, but it's not their fault. And so these are, this is another nice, I quite like this because it's not words laid out in that boring neurotypical way. It's a bit more interesting, but these are the challenges that you can expect, once again, from executive function. So I was talking to someone the other day, and I hear this quite a lot, that something hadn't gone well in work. So his manager had confronted him about it, and he was very emotional. And that is, you know, you don't always want that to be happening in the workplace, because it's, you know, I think we're all conscious that we should kind of not be crazily weeping when things go wrong because it seems so extreme. But when tensions are high and things have gone badly wrong or seem to have, and you think it's your fault, then it's all can be embarrassing and difficult to kind of get past. So, and again, you know, efforts. There are some fabulous memes on TikTok and Instagram. If you want to understand, well, about ADHD in particular, I've noticed, but about other conditions as well. Those are, if you want to understand a bit more about these conditions, those short bits of film and video are just great for bringing the point home. And I know one I follow is called Jen Has ADHD, and it's I find that really useful information in understanding that kind of condition, because we get frustrated when people won't get started on a job, and forgetting that they are massively frustrated. We say, just why don't you just do it? And they're thinking that themselves, but it doesn't happen. So so as I say, I don't dwell too long on this kind of technical side of things when talking to people, but it's useful to be aware that it is the brain that lies behind the challenges, and so we have to think about what to do to manage them. So, oh, and here we have yes, I threw this in kind of last minute, the Dyslexic Iceberg, but it applies to lots of conditions, but it's a great analogy, isn't it? Because and a lot of people that I talk to will openly say that they don't tell people about their dyslexia or ADHD or dyspraxia or whatever, because why should they? And they feel some people feel it's shameful, some people regard it as a weakness, and they don't want, and they feel that they should be dealing with it better often. But what we see as outsiders may be reading, writing, and spelling issues in emails, or a bit of disorganization. What we don't realize is going on underneath is lots of challenges with self-esteem, trying to remember stuff, dealing with visual stress, the uncomfortableness of looking at things, especially print, difficulties with organization and time management. And I've worked with people with dyslexia, and they were always the last to leave the office because they had to put in extra time to keep up with stuff. And in the beginning, you think, oh, what a hardworking person. They didn't want to have to put in that extra time, but they needed to. And in fact, I remember doing coaching with someone who had quite a complicated job and involved looking up lots of different things on different websites. So he had to have loads of tabs open and collect all that information and put it into a separate spreadsheet. And he could do the job, but it was very strictly target controlled. In order to meet his targets, it would take him 12 hours a day, we reckoned. But he was only being paid for 8 hours a day. So he wasn't keen on working those additional 4 hours for free. So that meant he lost his job because he wasn't meeting his targets. And he wasn't prepared to put in that time. And the reasonable adjustments that were put in for him were not enough to meet that need. So whether it was right or wrong, that's how it turned out. And he was massively stressed by that situation. So in terms of seeking positive outcomes for this, because it's all been a bit negative so far, right, there are ways of dealing with these challenges. And I think that there are 4 approaches, particularly in the workplace, but I think this probably applies to everywhere else. Pause for a little sip of water. So, and you can see a bit more of this kind of stuff developed on my YouTube channel. Feel free to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. So, as I say, I think there's 4 approaches. Technology is amazing stuff. And what is often recommended for people, certainly at university, obviously not in schools, I don't know why, it's crazy, but certainly in university and in the workplace, is technology that will read stuff to you and that you can dictate to capture your words rather than using a keyboard. The great thing about dictation is that you don't have to think about spelling. So that saves a lot of time. And again, the great thing about the reading out to you is that you don't have to decode words yourself, so that it will, you can just hear what they are. So on the surface, those are great advantages, but you have to make it work for you, because I use both those technologies from time to time myself. And I know if I'm going to dictate something, I've got to be organized in advance. I've got to plan out what I'm going to say, because if I just have a blank screen and it expects me to speak, then it's all, what was I going to say? So you have to, firstly, you have to have the training. You have to have a reasonably up-to-date piece of equipment to have this stuff installed on, because some of it is big programs and takes a lot of space. So you have to practice using it, and you have to work out when it's going to be useful and when it's going to save you time and when you don't need it. So one of the things with the reading out technology, and there's one big company who provides most of the stuff. The company is called Claro, and the reading software is called Claro Read, but they also have merged recently with Text Help Read and Write. So those are the two main options you may come across. And they do things like they will highlight the page or the line that you're reading, and you can change the background color so that it's much more visually comfortable. And they've got dictionaries to help you with words, and some of those dictionaries will have icons and pictures. So it's much more dyslexia friendly and useful. Quite expensive, needless to say. And so worth, if you find that sort of thing useful, getting it through workplace needs assessment or through university ways rather than buying it yourself. There are cheap alternatives or free alternatives. For example, on my mobile phone, I have a nice app called Otter, and Otter's really good. You can have a free version, or you can pay for it, and it's a dictation app. So when I'm out there up in Tredegar, walking the dog on the mountain, and I have a great idea, rather than having to get a piece of paper and pen in the driving rain and howling wind, I can just record it on my phone, and it's literally open the app, open a new document. It captures what I say pretty accurately, puts in the punctuation, and then I can email that document to myself. Then I've got it on the screen to look at and to edit. And quite a few of my YouTube scripts I've created while kind of out walking a dog, and ideas come into my head, and I've just read it out to myself. And so I've captured that idea then. So it's the principle that helps. Also, you can get some nice mind mapping software, and mind mapping is quite a good way of organizing ideas, because it's not, and some people like it, some people don't, must be said. Some people prefer a list, some people prefer mind mapping layout. But with the software, you can often have both options, and then convert your collection of ideas into a Word document. So it saves a lot of that organizational stuff. So the key message here with technology is to look out, see what there is, keep researching it, and find out how it can work for you. Whether you are a kid in school and you've got homework to do, or old person in work like me, it can be helpful. And it's called assistive technology or assistive software, but technology is a tool for everybody. And so I encourage you to explore. And I remember talking to someone who said, and this was a couple of years ago before COVID, that what they did, they used to have to go and visit people in the home and do a kind of assessment. And because they were dyslexic, they knew that they didn't like to write a lot of stuff down in front of people, because also they couldn't read their handwriting back. So they'd try and remember it all. Then when they got into their car, they would record a voice note and email that to themselves, so that when they got back to the office after the journey, then they could listen to it again and write it up into their report. If they didn't do that, then by the time they'd driven all the way, then they could easily have forgotten important information. So phones are amazing things, because there's loads of stuff on them, and making the most, and we have them with us all the time. This is a glory, isn't it? Pretty much that it's with us all the time. So make the most of it. Next area is environment. And I used to go and visit people in the workplace before COVID to do my coaching, and they would say, oh, the open plan office, I can't think, I can't concentrate. And when I do, someone comes along and interrupts me and I've lost my track. And the thing with interruption, if you've got dyslexia and these associated conditions, is that you just can't jump back into where you were. It takes 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes longer, to get back to where you were. So that's it. You know, if that happens 2 or 3 times a day, you know, you've lost an hour of working time. Also, you lose your thread. It's massively frustrating and tiring because you're just trying to put so much effort into doing your work, and so frustrating. So getting the right environment is very important. And quite a few of the people that I spoke to who were in that situation, when lockdown came and they were able to work from home in the quiet of their own garage or wherever, they could have what they needed around them, all their stuff so they could see. They didn't have to hot desk. They could be sure that they had the right just the perfect environment for them. Some people have 2 or 3 screens so they can see everything. They have the right chairs, the right temperature, because environment is not just noise, it's also temperature, it's also lighting. And if you work in an office or if you're in a school with a horrible overhead buzzing lighting, it can be a distraction and make it harder to concentrate. So, but there were other people that I spoke to who were working from home and they were having to homeschool their children, and they got a puppy, and there were half a dozen other people trying to work from home as well. So that was a nightmare for them. They wanted to be back in the office because their office was nice and had been nice and quiet, and they had a little room. So the point of this is that you have to know what works best for you. And I remember meeting people, again, before lockdown, both worked in the same office, and one person liked a bit of background noise and liked the atmosphere to be nice and cool. The other person, who was like on the opposite desk, liked absolute silence and for it to be completely warm and comfortable in that respect. So, and their manager was pulling their hair out because she didn't know how to meet the needs of both those people, and she obviously had an obligation to do so. But so what in that environment, in that situation, you have to, it's all about communication, isn't it? You have to say, what are the options? Have we got a quiet room where someone can go, where it can be warm or cool, or can person who likes noise have earphones with some noise of some sort that they like going on there? And I know some people, for example, who they might have headphones, or they might have like an iPad running. I remember someone saying to me they would have their favorite Harry Potter film running on an iPad on their desk while they were working on their computer, because it created the right environment for them to be able to concentrate. So it's a bit complicated, isn't it? And different tasks require different environments, I guess, because sometimes you want to be with other people, because if one of the issues is memory, and it can be for a lot of people with dyslexia, it's handy to have people to say, oh, how do we do the invoicing? Because if you only do it once a month, then you may not remember what it is. So having people around you can just ask easily is nice. Whereas these days, if you're working from home, you look on their schedule, oh, they've got a meeting coming up, oh, no, shall I ring them? Oh, perhaps I better not, don't want to disturb them. Shall I create a Teams meeting? It suddenly becomes a massive issue and it takes forever to resolve. But there are times when you want quiet so that you can concentrate. So knowing what you need for what activity is very important, because then you can start matching the environment. You can start talking to people, say, you know, I need to have quiet at this time to do this. And, you know, whereas other times I could be in with a group, and can we do something about the heating and the lighting and so on and so forth. So that self-awareness, which brings me into the coaching personal development thing, is critical. And the point with this is that it's all about, firstly, self-awareness, also self-acceptance, because, you know, dyslexia and associated conditions do have an impact. They do create challenges. I know that you hear a lot about superpowers that people have, and which is great. And I don't say that they don't exist, because they certainly do. And people with dyslexia do think a bit differently and do see things from a different angle. And if you can get the conditions right, then absolutely you're able to thrive. But it's useful to know what those conditions are and to accept the challenges that you have, if it's with the reading or writing or whatever it is. And that comes with, again, talking to people about it. And when in the workplace coaching that I do, often the first appointment is or can be very emotional for people, because often they've never spoken to anybody before about what it's like for them being dyslexic, and often they have you know, unhappy memories from people at school, and they carry that with them, because it's so powerful, isn't it? In those years when we're at school, what people say to us just sticks so much, and it can absolutely stay with you for life. And it's hard to change those values that have been imposed on you. I was talking to someone the other day who says how much shame he feels about being dyslexic, and you know, it's not your fault, and it doesn't have to make everything bad, because there are ways to manage the challenges. But you have to know, you have to accept that they are challenges and be prepared to deal with them, I suppose is my point. And the fourth thing is other people. And when other people understand about dyslexia and dyspraxia and ADHD and so on, life is a lot easier, because if they don't get it, then they can be unhelpful or annoying or worse. So the question is, how do we get other people to understand? And often that falls on the person with dyslexia themselves, because no one else will, and that's tough. And I know someone said to me recently, said, oh, people say to me at work, they say, you know, if you need anything, just ask for help, it's no problem. And he said, I don't want to be that person who has to keep asking for help, because it just makes me feel that I don't know what I'm doing. And why should I have to? You know, why can't they check from time to time, is everything okay? Is there anything else we can do to support you? And I think there would be much more of that if the characteristics were more visible. And because if you see someone with a physical disability struggling, then you know, you can put yourself forward and say, can I help? And because you see that there's a problem going on. But for someone with one of these invisible conditions, often we don't see the struggle. It's that iceberg thing. We might see a bit of a spelling mistake here and there, and do not realize that they've just spent the last 4 hours writing that email, and now they're way behind on all the other stuff they've got to do. So informing other people or building their awareness is vitally important. So, and I would commend to you those 2 mind maps at the start, which, as I say, I shall put into a folder to make available to you all, because they are great starting points for getting the conversation going. So, and here's some questions that I use when talking to people, and I haven't made them up myself, sadly. They are called person-centered planning tools, and person-centered planning is something that's used a lot, as I'm sure you may be aware, in social care. And the great thing about them is that they are really simple, and they're direct, and they're effective. And I use them all the time myself when talking to people, and in my life. And especially the what's working, what's not working is great. And one of the nice things about that, when someone is in a situation, and it could be going well or it could be not going well, it's about the stuff that's happening. It's not about the person. So if you can say what's working, if they, I think someone I do some coaching with, they enjoy the social aspect of the team that they work with. They like the job, but what's not working are some of the relationships, because people are overstepping their roles and the time scales and the distribution of tasks. So by asking those questions, you can start to work out what someone's strengths are and what the good stuff is to use to deal with the issues where things are not working. And it's not then about anybody's personal qualities, it's about the situation. So it really teases things out, get a piece of paper, 2 columns, what's working, what's not working, make it nice and visual. I would encourage you to give it a shot today because it works all the time. Another one I love is important to and important for. Again, 2 columns, piece of paper or whiteboard or whatever. Important to is about what matters most to you. And if you start asking that to people, then you get to know what is important to them. And then the important for is what do they need in order to be able to do what matters most to them. So again, that teases out stuff. You get to learn about that person's values, and often what's important to them is they want to get the job done. They want to be able to do it well. They want people to feel that they're competent in doing what they're doing. And so what do they need for that? And it might be they need time, or they might need the right environment, or they might need certain resources. But again, it's no longer personal, it's about the situation, and you can start getting your creative thinking going to deal with that. Good day and bad day is also a brilliant question to ask. It's so simple. What makes a good day? I would encourage you to do it yourselves, for yourself. Write down 2 columns. Good day, bad day. What makes a good day and what makes a bad day? And once you've got it written down, you can see it, then that does something, gets the brain thinking, right, how can I make more good days? How can I create more of these things or that contribute to that good day? And how can I have less of that stuff that creates a bad day? So, and the 4+1 is a great reflection tool. What have we tried? And because what I find out, certainly with people with ADHD, is that you need lots of strategies, and they don't always last, because things need to be fresh and interesting and attention grabbing. So you have to try lots of things, and it's useful to have a good list then. What have you tried? What have you learned about the things that you've tried? What are you pleased about? So what's the good stuff? What are you concerned about? And therefore, what next? So it covers everything. So I thoroughly recommend it. Really useful. And if you want to find out more about this kind of approach, because this is just a few of the questions, if you look up person-centered planning on the internet, I'm sure you'll find loads of stuff. So problem solving is a big thing, because obviously dyslexia and so on creates challenges. So I reckon that there are 4 approaches that you can take. You can ask, what resources do I need to help me deal with this problem? And that can be things as simple as Post-it notes, which are a lot nice and colorful stuff, or whiteboards, or blackboard. Some people prefer blackboard. On my fridge, I've got a whiteboard and a blackboard, and the appropriate pens for both. And I've got to say, the blackboard sticks out much more visually powerful. And I got these boards on my fridge because I got the idea from someone else, needless to say. And they said what they do, because they had ADHD, their husband had ADHD, they had 3 children with ADHD. So keeping on top of the shopping list was challenging. So when people took stuff, used up the last of the stuff in the fridge, they would write on the fridge door where the whiteboard was what it was that they had used up, so that then when the shopping day came around, whoever was going could take a picture of these things and therefore go to the shop and have a list of everything that was wanted. And I think, and they had a separate, I can't quite remember their system, but the black board was for slightly different stuff than the whiteboard. But I would say try them both. And I remember talking to someone about strategies. And what I find when I talk to people is I say, when I recommend strategy to them, they always say, oh yeah, that doesn't work for me. But now you mention it, something else does. And this happened with someone I was saying about, have you thought of using a whiteboard, get all these ideas out of your head, get them down so at least you can see everything, so it's not so overwhelming. So I don't like, it's never really worked for me, the whiteboard. And so we're talking generally about stuff, and I found out that he has his phone on dark mode and he has his computer on dark mode as well, because he prefers black rather than white, and white writing instead of black. So so then we thought, yeah, try a blackboard instead of a whiteboard. Worked much better. So there's lots of ideas flying around. They're not always obvious, but if we think imaginatively, often with other people, it helps come up with useful resources. Collaborators as well are people who can help out. And I was talking to someone yesterday who is a fireman, and he's just got promoted, and he's going to a new team. And so he'll be working with this other chap together. And the other so they have to deliver training, and there's loads of admin. Well, this chap I was talking to doesn't like admin because he's dyslexic, but he loves doing the training. His colleague doesn't like doing the training, but he loves to do the admin. So that is a great collaboration, because between the two of them, they get the job done, and neither of them has to do what they don't particularly want to do. Obviously, there's overlap, isn't there? But if you can find people who will work with you, play to your strengths, then that is hugely helpful. So if you've written something, if you're a kid in school and if you've written something, you just say to someone, can you have a quick look at this to make sure it makes sense to you? Then that takes a lot of stress out of the situation. And often, we're all human beings. We are able to give back that time and effort that we have asked for from someone else. Technologies I've already spoken about a bit, and strategies. Before lockdown, a lot of people used to say to me that they would get up early to go to work early when it was quiet, or they would stay late when it was quiet. And I know I met a chap who did, it's very key, he's a lorry driver. And so he usually does day trips, but sometimes he does an overnight trip. So he needs stuff for that. And he's keen on yachting, so he needs stuff for that. And he's a keen walker, so he needs stuff for that. And he would get in a mess with all this stuff until he got a bag for each of his activities, and he's got a special rack by the front door. And so he makes sure at the end of the day, whenever he's done what he's done, that he fills up his bag. So it's got, water and a packet of biscuits and sanitizer and spare jacket or whatever he needs for that activity, so that when he goes out, he can just pick up the right thing. And I was telling this to a person I was doing some coaching with who had 3 young children. They said, I'll do exactly the same with my children, so that their PE bags are all sorted in advance, and their after school activity bags, and they're all near the front door, so that there's not that last minute craziness when you suddenly realize that you haven't got this and you haven't got that, and where's this and where's that, and you're all held up and massively stressed. And in fact, I met someone as well, one of the first people I did coaching with, who told me that they had showed me their list in the morning, said, this is what I have, and it had wallet, phone, keys, lunch, diary, I think it's something else. He said, because what used to happen is he'd get up in the morning and he'd have his breakfast and he'd go out to the car to go to work, and then he'd come back because he didn't have the keys, and he'd go back out again, and then he'd come back because he didn't get the phone, and then he'd go back out again, drive off, then half an hour later he'd come back because he'd forgotten his lunch. So so his wife spotted this, made him this list, so he checked it all off. It's a simple thing, but it makes a big difference. Someone else I met who had a hook by the front door for their keys, because losing things can happen a lot. And so they come into their house, hang the keys on the hook right by the door. So, and all the people that I meet have loads of strategies. So, but often talking around to other people can be useful in coming up with others. So if you've got a problem or situations aren't working well, these are your 4 options. You've got to think, what resources can I use? What collaborators could be out there to work with me? What technologies would help here? What strategies could I use? And it could be some or all of those things. So here we go, near the end now. So 3 things to do. I kind of have this 3 sections, because in terms of solutions, it's quite useful to think 3 options, again, on top of those previous 4. Make it multi-sensory. If you want it to stick, make it multi-sensory so that it's not just words in the air. If you give someone a list of instructions and you just tell them, you know, do this, do that, and that, and that, and that, and that, it won't work. You've got to bring it alive and, you know, write it down or make it real, attach something physical to it. But that has a much better chance of getting itself embedded in the brain. Breaking things down into small chunks always works. I can't think of a time when it doesn't. But sometimes you don't think that. You think, oh, I've got to do this thing. I don't know where to start. But if you can stop yourself and think, how can I break this down into small parts, then the start might be easier to see. And outsourcing is a favorite of mine because a PowerPoint is a classic outsourcing. It's all this stuff here, because having it on a screen saves me having to remember it and describe it. So, you know, and the phone, you know, a diary is a form of outsourcing stuff, and making it, for example, if you use a diary on the screen, using a lot of color into that will make it a bit more multi-sensory. But getting stuff out of your head, sometimes just a question of writing it all down. And someone told me recently what they do is for everything that they have to do, they write it all down, and then they divide it into 3 lists of their personal stuff, their work stuff, and their family stuff. And that helps them then create their to-do list of what they've got to do. But getting out and being able to see it is what helps them most. If you keep it all in, then it gets overwhelming and stressful. So here we are, call to action. So I think it's important to understand dyslexia, and I hope I've given you a bit of an insight. It'd be interesting to see what you think and what your experiences are. And it's important to celebrate the strengths, because there are loads of strengths. Nobody wants to be defined by a single condition anyway. But often, once you're talking to people with dyslexia, ADHD, and so on and so forth, it becomes apparent the stuff that they are good at. They don't always see it themselves, because if things aren't going well, then you just see the negative stuff, don't you? So it's important to celebrate those strengths and to make them clear to people, and normalizing the support strategies, you know, things like making lists, having things visible. Here's my calendar, keep this on the wall by me here, it's nice and colorful. I have loads of stuff around me that you can't see to help me remember stuff. This is a favorite. As I said, I don't always remember to do this, but visual prompts work for loads of people, and using assistive software works for loads of people. And one of the things is, when you go to a building, if you go to an office building that's got steps, you'll see a ramp, won't you? And you think, oh, right, this is a reasonable adjustment for people with a physical difficulty getting into that building. And there might be one of those buttons on the door that makes it open electronically. You think, oh, that's a reasonable adjustment for people with physical difficulty getting into the building. And you might see some braille or white lines on the steps, and you think, oh, that's a reasonable adjustment for people with a visual impairment. But the reasonable adjustments for people with dyslexia are often invisible. And so what that means is that people don't know what to do to manage the challenges. So I think it's important to for us all to use those software dictation and read aloud when we can, so that we can recommend them to others, and to outsource stuff, and to make lists, and to use color and make it multi-sensory, so it would make the world a better place for everybody. So that is it. This is me again. Find me on Facebook, YouTube, everywhere else. That's it. Any questions? Let's stop sharing now and come back to where we are. Are you still awake?
Yeah, you've got a couple of questions in the chat, Guy.
All right, so I've got to read them. Hang on. All right.
Some are around children in schools and the lack of assessments currently in the education system.
Right. Okay, right. So there's one here. Could I ask, I've got a friend, daughter that's recently been diagnosed with dyslexia, just started secondary school and things got a lot worse. She's been fainting in school on a daily basis, does not cope with the pressure. Would like to say this has only started since starting secondary school and being diagnosed with dyslexia. Any advice would be appreciated. All medical assessments have come back clear. Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Medical assessments have come back clear, massively important. It is secondary school. I used to be a support teacher for young people in schools with visual impairments for 20 years. And I can tell you that, and I did, my responsibility was secondary schools. And that transition for a start from primary to secondary is massively stressful. And what happens in primary school is that there's just a few teachers, the head teacher's fairly accessible, so parents can have a good dialogue with the school and things seem to be under control. And by year 6, the kid knows everybody often, and everybody knows everybody else quite often, so that systems are fairly friendly and supportive. And then you go to a comp and there's millions of other kids there who you don't know, so there's a lot of peer pressure and that can be difficult. There's all these different teachers. The speed of everything is so much greater. You're going from one lesson to another. There's so much stuff that you're expected to remember. I mean, obviously, you know all this, but if you're dealing with a situation that has an impact on short-term memory, as dyslexia does, then you're going to put yourself under pressure about forgetting stuff. Then there's going to be pressure about spelling and grammar and presenting stuff well. And there was a discussion recently I heard with Matt Hancock by another person with dyslexia about if, as Matt Hancock is proposing, all children in schools are assessed for neurodiversity, won't that just be labeling those who are, and maybe that's a negative thing? And Matt Hancock said, which I thought was quite sensible for a politician, he said children label themselves anyway and label each other. So, and that's the thing. So, but what's important is that the label is correct if there's going to be one, and people will label themselves as stupid and lazy if things aren't working, despite what they're doing. So what the question is, what to do about it? Well, firstly, I would say if that, and I think there was a diagnosis, wasn't there, of dyslexia. Okay, so firstly, you got to get onto the SENCO or the additional learning needs person and make sure that they are aware that the child has dyslexia and that there are particular challenges. And if the child is fainting, I would say what you want is the opportunity for that child to be able, because that's massive pressure, isn't it? That's what they're doing. They are just withdrawing themselves from the situation in the best way possible. And not intentionally either. It's just massive overwhelm. So they need to have somewhere to go to be able to recover and get their equilibrium back. So, and start feeling better. So then you need to feel, as a parent, you would want to feel confident that the teachers in the school knew that your child had dyslexia and that they had some strategies to deal with that. And you'd be wanting to see some evidence, wouldn't you? You would want to be able to say, what are the teachers doing that proves they are understand and managing the impact of dyslexia here? So I would say also it'd be useful having a chat with your daughter with that dyslexia mind map, saying, you know, what are your experiences? Because I would imagine the daughter is massively overwhelmed all the time and presumably doesn't want to go to school. I wouldn't. if those kinds of things were happening. So I would say get some understanding going about what's happening, what's working, what's not working, what are the subjects that are good, what are the subjects that are bad, what makes a good day, what's a bad day. I would definitely say approach it as a project, use those questions, and keep a constant dialogue with the school. So you can tell them that you're doing stuff at home. What are they doing? So what else have we got?
On that note, Guy, Anna asked a question earlier, which was, is there anywhere that people can get free dyslexia assessments? Would they need to go to their GP? There seems to be a lot of dyslexia assessments that have been paid for, which is a barrier for people who are unemployed or on a low income.
The this is a bit of a yes and a no kind of question, because dyslexia assessment is incredibly expensive. But there is a charity called Helen Arkell Charity. Let me put it in the chat. And they do every year a few assessments for free. And they're online. So I'm not quite sure what the process is. One of the things, if you're a student, I think you can get a fairly or discounted, a cheapish assessment through the university. But unfortunately, it is expensive because the people who do it, you have to have 2 degrees to do it. It's the tests that you have to use cost an absolute fortune. Well, not an absolute fortune. They are expensive and everybody has to have them. It's a tightly controlled job sphere, so it is expensive. But there are, and you know, the big companies like I think Lexic and British Dyslexia Association charge more than small local providers. So there are small companies like in South Wales. My sister-in-law started a company called Golexia. They've been going for 10 years or so. They are cheaper than, they're not cheap, but they're cheaper than the British Dyslexia Association. So I would encourage you to look for local providers. Also, you can, well, one of the things about having a dyslexia assessment is that it's not always life-changing for the school, because when I was in education, and I left in 2016, so things might have changed, but what happened in South Wales or in Wales is that every few years children were tested on their reading and writing, and if they fell below a certain level, then they were entitled to support. So someone would come in and give them some additional tuition. So that was regardless of whether they had dyslexia or not. And if they were dyslexic but worked hard, had strategies, and were above that threshold, they didn't get support. So having a diagnosis will not automatically get you the key to support, unfortunately. So I think what is useful is to work out, using the stuff I've shown you, what the challenges are. There are, you know, YouTube is a great resource for ideas about dealing with things like dyslexia. And interestingly, all the people I talk to who have done a degree, well, maybe not all, because I haven't asked everybody, but the vast majority of people that I asked, say, how do you manage, you know, doing your degree? They said, with all that reading you have to do, they say, oh, I did it all on YouTube. There is so much stuff on YouTube. So, and it's so much easier to use because you can see it, you know, you can see it several times, you can repeat it. And so I would encourage you to look up useful dyslexia support strategies on YouTube. There are plenty of books out there as well. And whatever is your preferred means. And Facebook has got loads of groups similarly that are supportive, so asking people what worked for them. What I found is that because everybody is different things work for different people. So you've got to try different strategies, talk to other people to keep the ideas flowing. Don't let it make you miserable, because I speak to lots of people who school was a struggle, but you get through if you're determined. Here's the thing, the most important thing you need from school is an A star in self-confidence, and that comes partly from your parents and the people around you, because school makes you feel that everything has to be done right now, and then there's the next thing, and then there's the next thing. And actually, life's not really like that. What's important is determination, integrity, creative thinking, problem solving, having a good bunch of people around you. If you've got those things working for you to support you through the hard times as well as the good, then you will get to where you want to be. But it is harder for people with dyslexia. You have to work harder if you're going to be in the neurotypical world, but it's not impossible. So it takes patience and effort, but hang on in there.
I think, Guy, as well, one of the sort of common themes that I can see as well is about this, even though you've kindly reassured us that, assessment isn't the be all and end all, but should you wish to get an assessment like that, how do you know that the person that's doing the assessment is qualified to do that, and that the assessment that you then can shell out some significant pennies on will then be validated either in school or in the workplace?
That is a very good question. And as you can tell from the way I'm answering, I am playing for time here while I think about what the correct answer is. The person who does a dyslexia assessment needs to be a qualified assessor. So I can't recall the name of that qualification to my mind. Maybe someone out there knows it and can put it in the chat. But otherwise, I shall look it up and put it in the stuff I send out. So you want to see that, if someone says, oh, I'm a dyslexia assessor, you want to know what their qualification is. And I'll tell you once I find out what it is, name of qualification. And you can ask them what tests they're going to use.
One of the reasons why I've sort of put that question forward, Guy, is that I come across parents who have, because of the very lengthy, unfortunately, sometimes waiting lists for assessment for neurodiversity, etc., they resort to paying for a private ASD, ADHD assessment, and then sometimes find that some institutions, e.g. schools, won't recognise the private assessment and insist that it has to go through the health board and their formal process. So I was just wondering whether there was a way, if you like, that parents would be able to say, but this has been assessed by somebody who knows their onions.
Yes, that is important. And that comes up with a report with recommendations, because on the one hand, if you have an assessment, it will tell you that basically that your level of intelligence falls within a certain range, and that as measured by an IQ test, and that these other tests, which are to do with memory recall and literacy, they show that you are below the level that you would expect of someone with your intelligence, as measured on that IQ level. So, which suggests that you have issues to do with your working memory and so on and so forth. So that's relative. So that's quite useful in a way. It tends to be produced, because they are quite technical documents. It's not always it's not an easy read necessarily, because all this dense stuff, it's a lot of numbers and print. So it can be hard to, especially if you're dyslexic, to make sense of it. But basically what you want to know is, am I dyslexic or not? Also, as someone pointed out to me, it's quite a tough test, because you have to fail at things to show you're dyslexic, because they test to see how good you are. So for example, you read a passage and you have to answer questions on it. And for people kind of later in life, my age, that can often be quite an emotional thing, because you realize you don't know the answer. You've just read this thing perfectly well, so it seems, and then someone's asking you stuff, you should know it, you feel, but you don't. And so it's not always a great experience for people. But the key thing is always, isn't it, is what next? What is the school going to do about it? And I guess that is something that's worth a YouTube video, isn't it? It's so what, you know, how are you going to make lessons more accessible? How are you going to demonstrate any kind of reasonable adjustment? For some people, what happens, and I hear this quite a lot from people, oh, they just give me a yellow overlay. And some people that helps, it makes reading easier. For some people, it doesn't. So you'd want to know what the school are going to do. And that's why it's useful to have information from the child as much as possible, because some lessons will be good. There are some fabulous teachers out there who intuitively get it. Whatever is going on for the child, they understand about learning. They can put themselves in the position of that child. But there are plenty of other teachers who are not like that. They're just churning out the information and don't have that knack. So it's worth finding out from your child, what are the good lessons, what are the harder lessons, so that you can kind of pinpoint your approach, and which always makes it easier, isn't it? If you can provide some solutions to the people in school and say, well, if in English, you know, my child is not obliged to stand up and read out loud, or you know, if whatever activities you're going to do, if you can find out what they're going to be, then they can be modified. You know, sometimes it helps if the print is different, or if the stuff is read out rather than having to be read by the person themselves. It's about thinking creatively on that detail. So it's again, it's a bit of a project, isn't it? It's about focusing support, finding out what the child likes as much as you can, because they're obviously not necessarily gonna know, but if you can get some hints and clues about where they are happy, what works for them, and that stuff that's not so good, then you can start to give advice to the school. Obviously, it's not your obligation to do that, and you hope that these people are the experts, but that's not always the case. So the more help you can give them, the easier it is. And don't give up. That is the main thing. Don't ever give up, and hang on in there. Find people who've had similar experiences before, find out what works for them, and just keep being positive and finding ideas, you know, off the internet, off books. And remember that life is full of lots of things. It's not just what goes on at school, isn't it? So you've got to, I heard a thing this morning on an audiobook I was listening, because I'm a big fan of audiobooks. It said, what was it? The quality of life depends upon your capacity for delight. So the chap I mentioned earlier, who had a hard time in school because he needed his headphones in order to concentrate and was constantly told off, and had a regular seat in the headmaster's study. And ironically, both his parents were head teachers. So, but what kept him going was that certainly when he was a teenager, was that he did a lot of motorsports outside school. He had activities that he could focus his energy on, and now he does motor racing. So unexpectedly, So, you know, if you can find other things that are rewarding and pleasurable so that school isn't about everything, then that helps build confidence and self-esteem. And that's the main thing to be focusing on, isn't it? Keeping your child's self-confidence, self-esteem up at all times.
And I would say that the slight chink of hope here is the introduction of the new ALN bill in Wales, where specific learning disabilities like dyslexia are included under that legislation. So I would just say to people, keep raising it, keep talking to people about it, keep contact with the school and explain, you know, wherever you can, where either you or your child are having difficulties. And, you know, the more cooperation and the more, like you said, that people can work together to solve issues like this, the better it will be for everybody. There was another really interesting quick question from Kit as well, from Blue Cross, which is about the recruitment process. And they've asked, this is such a good session, thanks. At Blue Cross, we've started to change our fonts to Arial 12 in emails and turn some of our systems like Teams onto dark mode, which is really helpful. I'd love to hear your views on how to make recruitment processes more dyslexia friendly.
Yes, well, I have lots of views on that. And because the whole recruitment process for some people with dyslexia is a massive headache, and they will put up with, and I'm talking to several people in this situation at the moment, they'll put up with misery at work because the misery in their current job is slightly less than the misery of having to go through the job application form, because so many of the people that I find that I talk to with dyslexia hate a form. Give them a form, they can't bear it. And that's often where job application starts, drives them crazy. So that's tricky. And also, you know, reading through the job spec and the essential and desirable characteristics and everything, knowing what to put in can be difficult. So I think if you can, where possible, one perspective is to encourage people to contact for a chat a bit more than rely on just communication via filling in forms. I think I've done quite a long and boring video about recruitment. I'm not sure if it's been posted yet, but because my daughter works in recruitment, and so I've got lots of useful insights. But so taking the writing out as much as possible, and for the actual interview, then things like giving people the questions in advance and giving them the confidence to start off with. You know, if you say we're a dyslexia friendly organization, so let us know what would help you in the interview. Things like having the questions to see if they know, if they've got to do a task or something, knowing about that well in advance so they can prepare, and having you know, because you're looking to get the best people. It's you really want to get those qualities. So giving your applicants the confidence that that is what lies behind this process, that you want to find the right person for the job. So you're going to take time to do that. So you're going to give them the opportunity to respond to questions in their own time. You're going to give them questions in advance. I'll tell you what I'll do, Kit, is I shall write out a bit of a list and send it to you or add it to the pack, because the more I think of it, the more my mind is unraveling and becoming full of waffle, and you could do with just half a dozen good points. So let me make a note.
And by the way, Guy, there was a couple of comments on people really liked your Avengers image.
hey, I don't know it's legal, so don't spread it around. You know, I don't want to get into trouble. So, or anybody else. But it's a visual thing, isn't it? And that captures the imagination. And you know, I can call it to mind. As I say, I'm very neurotypical. I'm not dyslexic, but it works for me. And it's so much easier when to kind of look that in your mind's eye than it is, for example, looking at all this page of names. It's quite tricky, isn't it, would be to pick out any of them afterwards. So a powerful visual makes a big difference.
I don't know if there's any other questions. I can't particularly see them in the chat. There's comments. I think a lot of people are agreeing with comments other people have made or you've made, particularly around sort of physical effects of the anxiety around
Oh yeah.
in school and stuff.
I saw a thing about teaching assistants, and you know, schools do have teaching assistants, and how well they are trained, and often they're moved around. In my experience, they would be moved around, different people. So, and you get such a diversity, or you can do, in a school of need among children. So it's hard for a teaching assistant to be brilliant at everything. And also, they are kind of at the mercy of the teacher as well. And I used to do a lot of classroom support in the olden days, back at the turn of the century. And you know, you go into a lesson not knowing what to expect as a support person, because you never got to see the teacher in advance. So you kind of always on the back foot. So that's tricky, providing the right level of support. Also, you've got to be quite good at building a rapport. And also, you don't have the knowledge and information about how that person learns best necessarily. It requires, you know, if you're going to, it takes quite a long time to learn from some kid how they learn best, because they often don't know themselves. So if you can get access to that person and give them a few insights as to how your child learns best, and build a rapport with that teaching assistant or those teaching assistants yourself, that can be really useful for them, because they're not going to say, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, because that makes them feel anxious about their jobs. So they need a bit of support and inside information. So it's a bit of a collaborative thing. And encouraging them to go on training sessions for dyslexia. Perhaps we should put on a teaching assistant awareness raising session, and I think that might be helpful. And the thing about stomach pains and feeling sick, that is a classic anxiety symptom, isn't it? So you know, and you can't dispute it as well. So, and, you know, it's stressful, isn't it? If you're at home and, you know, you need to get out to work and that sort of thing. And it's one thing if your child's got a broken leg, because you can say to the world, look, my child's got a broken leg, I've got to support them. And everyone goes, yeah. And if you say, oh, my child's got a stomach ache, they say, oh, you know, I'm sure they'll be all right when they get to school. And it's not like that for people with dyslexia and neurodiverse conditions. So I would commend to you once again those questions, you know, what's working, what's not working, where are the good bits of school? And I remember I used to support a boy in school, and he was a lovely boy, and he had really quite poor vision, and he didn't like school all that much. I could tell, because he didn't do much work in the lessons, and so that was a struggle. But I'd say to him, you know, so what do you feel about school? He says, oh, I love coming to school. I go, oh, I didn't realize that. He said, yeah, I just don't like the lessons. And he loved the kind of social aspect. And he was, you know, he'd chat with the teachers and he'd chat with the people in his class. He just didn't like having to do all the learning. And, you know, I was a lot more ignorant in those days. Maybe he was dyslexic, and, you know, but using Braille is hard work and not very engaging. So, but there were, you know, some lessons are okay, some lessons are horrible. So if you can work with your child and find out, If there's any good stuff that they can look forward to, then you can support them on that. And what is really problematic and difficult, you can give them a good example of problem solving and say, you know, let's have a think about how we can make this better. Let's get a long-term strategy, whether it's about informing the teacher, getting friends on side, collaborators, maybe there's some resources that might help, maybe there's some technology that might help. If you get that process going, then that might give a bit of light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, I think that's just about it, unless anyone else has any questions they want to throw in at the last minute. But I'd really like to thank you in particular, Guy, for talking to everybody this morning. It's been incredibly helpful and informative, and many of the comments on the chat, which I will send over to you, are echoing that as well. So I think people have, in the main, appreciated it. And Kit in particular is looking forward to watching your quote long and boring video on recruitment. So
yes, and I think it's long and boring part one. There might even be another bit lurking. But well, thank you for everybody for taking the time, and I hope it's been useful. Any feedback they want to send, feel free. Bits that could be improved, so on and so forth. I can take criticism because I'm kind of safe in my, you know, all the snow's melted now, I can run away. But it'd be good to know what people thought was useful and what could be better. And yes, and I shall send some stuff out so that they've got something to look back on, because we are all the dyslexia avengers, haven't we? It's down to us to make a difference. We can't rely on government or, you know, because, for example, as my last thing to say is that I do coaching with people in the police, in the health service and other big organizations. They all have policies about dyslexia. But if it doesn't filter down to the person, you know, equivalent of the person in the classroom or the manager, then it's just a piece of paper. So it's down to us to make a difference.
and it's a piece of paper that people sometimes struggle to read.
Absolutely, absolutely. Guidance.
Brilliant. I'm going to stop the recording now. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernadette, for arranging it.